How do I stop painful patterns in my life? How do I mend the past, my past life, so that I can live in the present again? How can I make joyful connections with others, with God, and even hopefully with myself? That's what we're talking about today. As always, I'm Jeff Holsclaw, and this is the Embodied Faith podcast, where we are integrating neuroscience, spiritual formation, and faith. And we're brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which is seeking to grow faith for everyday people. I'm really excited about today's guest. It's Dr. Allison Cook, who is a psychologist and a writer who specializes in bringing faith and psychology together to create real change in people's life. Her first book, which unfortunately I haven't read yet, but I'm going to get it, is called Boundaries for the Soul. It is a faith-based adaptation of the IFS model, or the internal family systems model. And then she also has a new book, most recently has come out, called The Best of You: Break Free from Painful Patterns, Mend Your Past, and Discover Your True Self in God. Dr. Cook, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what I always like to ask people is, like, how did you get into this? So when was the aha moment where you were like, psychology and faith needs to go together? They belong together. Like, how did that happen for you?
It happened early on. It's sort of the 20-year story and then the 2-year story. The 20-year story is I knew God, loved God. I really came to follow Jesus in college. Grew up in a Christian home, knew the Bible, knew all sorts of things about theology, had all the kind of right thinking, as they say, and really had no clue about who I was. And so what I did is I sort of internalized literally, very literally, these messages about die to yourself. Well, I shouldn't know who I am. I shouldn't think about
Mm,
myself. I shouldn't get to know myself. But ironically, I was really good at sort of being with other people in pain. I was high in empathy. I kind of knew how to. People would come tell me they're terrible. So I started studying counseling. I started studying psychology. It's sort of a cliche thing where all of a sudden I'm practicing as a therapist and I'm really kind of falling apart on the
mm.
inside. No God, love others, no clue about myself. And so I had to sort of take a time out, take a couple of years to get to know my own psyche, my own soul. That's what led to the first book. I came across this model of therapy that really worked to help me understand my own soul. And so, kind of academically, I got it. I got that psychology and theology go together. We know God to know ourselves, we know ourselves to know God. But in practice, I didn't really understand what that meant. And so this was sort of a hard won journey of kind of figuring out, how do I turn the mirror a little bit onto myself? And why isn't that selfish? Why is that, in fact, healthy? Began to see this over and over in my practice as I was working over the last 2 decades.
Oh, I love that. So you said you know God, know others with a K, but you had no clue about yourself,
Yeah.
as in no idea. And so this book kind of comes out of that
Yeah.
journey, personal journey, as well as the journey that you see in a lot of your clients. Um, and so early on in the book, you say we have to develop a deep connection to our own sense of self, work that goes hand in hand with trusting the one who made us. So these are kind of like the two kind of
Yeah.
big topics that you're talking about. So and you just kind of alluded to it a little bit, but how did how did you find out that you needed to develop this true sense, or and you don't say true self that often. I mean, I know it's in the title, but
Yeah.
like the sense of self, this whole
Just,
self.
it started with academically, right? I was very disconnected from myself, but didn't know it. And I'll tell you how I figured that out. But I was drawn to these more humanistic thinkers. Like, I remember Carl Rogers' book called On Becoming a Person, right, in my doctoral work. And I was like, what does that mean to become a person? Like, nobody's ever talked to me about that. Or Erickson's Stages of Development. Well, what does that mean to gain a sense of internal integrity? So academically, I was very drawn to these ideas, but nobody had taught me what that meant. And so in my real life, so I was reading all this stuff, but again, disconnected. In my real life, what was happening is I was deeply lonely, deeply disconnected from other people. My relationships were increasingly one way. just focus more on other people. That's kind of what I had internalized practically, is what it meant to be a Christian. Just focus on other people, keep the focus on them. Well, not coming to my friends saying, "Man, I'm struggling. Man, I'm lonely. Man, I don't know what's going on. Like, I'm working so much or I'm reading so much. I'm trying to understand all this stuff in my head, but I'm disconnected from any of these painful emotions in me." And as is the way with painful emotions, they just began, they don't go away when we don't acknowledge them. So all that loneliness, all of that, I began to just kind of feel empty inside, just to, burnout, really 101. All of that came to the surface, and I had a literal panic attack. And it's funny because I was studying it and I was like, oh, this is a I understand the difference between an anxiety attack and a panic attack, and I'm having a panic attack. And being someone who never thought about anxiety in myself, never thought about these feelings inside of myself, there I was in the middle of it. And so that was the rumblings of a soul that was like, we need your attention. I need your attention. I need to learn how to pay attention to these tugs inside my own soul. How do I show up in my relationships with other people, and not just have one way relationships where it's just always oriented outwardly?
Yeah. And I think, and the Christians are like trained to do that, right? So
That
you think like good spiritual formation is to love God, love others. We're supposed to serve and focus on others. Uh, and so early on in the book, you actually kind of hit that head on, and you make these distinctions between being selfish and
Yeah,
being increasing your sense of selfhood.
yeah,
So having a positive sense of selfhood is a good thing, which is what I think you're trying to help people uh, achieve. But then I know a lot of people, especially women, but also men in different ways, feel,
yeah.
well, isn't that like, aren't we just leaving the way of Christ then? So how do you kind of help people understand that difference?
Yeah, because I talk about, I mean, literally in that period of time where I was so run down, I that thought occurred to me. I thought, what do I want? What do I need? I never asked that question, right? I never learned how to, in a healthy way, say, what do I need right now? That felt so selfish to me. And that's
Mm.
it surely does feel selfish, right? We're not taught. And again, culturally, sometimes we can take that to an extreme. And so I kind of lay this out in a chart. Like on one hand, there's selfishness, which is, it's only about what I want. It's only about what I need. It's only about what I can get from other people.
Mm.
That's not what we're after. That's not selfhood. That's not a healthy sense of self. But on the other extreme, we have this selflessness that I think is often taught in our faith communities, which is that it's never about me. It should never be about my needs. I should always put myself last. That also is a direct road to burnout, isolation, loneliness, and unhealthy relationships and codependency, right? Because we actually do need to bring ourselves into our relationships. And then I look at Jesus and this model, I call it selfhood. That's a psychology term, which is this sense of self. God made us to be a person, to be a human, right? And right talks about becoming more human, and that's not a bad thing. And we see this example in Jesus of a strong sense of self. And I started to study his life, and I was like, Jesus, we talk about Jesus being selfless, but Jesus was not a doormat. Jesus inserted his opinions, he inserted his convictions, he had preferences, he said yeses and nos, he took care of himself, he knew when he needed time away, he knew when he needed to move toward. That came from a strong sense of himself. There was a conviction there. And I think that's where I started to land on, boy, we need to be careful, about teaching people to die to a self or become selfless before they have a self that they
Mm.
understand how to care for and steward.
Yeah. Oh, that's super important. And well, I just want to review because I love this. So on the one hand, we can be too selfish. On
Yeah,
the other
for sure.
hand, we can be too selfless, is what you say, where you're thinking about yourself not enough. But the goal is to have this kind of secure or established selfhood. And that goes along with Jesus's statement, like, love your neighbor as what? As yourself, right? So you
That's
kind of
right.
need this kind of corresponding uh, kind of kind of thing fitting together. And for me, so as a fairly confident, male pastor, yeah, and then reading the Bible, right? The cost of discipleship, the call of discipleship is to carry your cross, deny yourself, follow me. And
Mhm.
so, with a person of privilege, like I have in many ways, and then even by disposition and temperament, a fairly confident and outgoing person, um, right? That's the call that I need to hear. But if you're
Yeah.
working with people who are traumatized, who have less privilege in those kind of sense, that call to discipleship just doubles down on what they're feeling all the time already. And that's no help. That's not good news. This is not, lay your burdens down and, find all the freedom in Christ. Right? It's just more of the same. And so that's kind of what you're speaking to a little bit, right? Like if you're already beat down, traumatized, and you have these cultural expectations, especially what women have, uh, that's not a call that sounds like freedom at all.
Yeah, exactly, and I appreciate your kind of naming that because I think part of it was that through my early 20s, I was shaped by very confident male, and again, I learned great theology, I learned great scripture, but this just die to yourself, you're, kind of this beating down of the self, and I get it. I think that's the right message for some people, even some women. I don't want to say it's not only, that's
Right, right.
I think that could be the right message for some people. But for many of us who are really trying to, okay, okay, I'll just obliterate my sense of self altogether, even though I never even had a sense of self, it can lead to this road of chronic people pleasing, codependency. And again, like you're saying, and you add that overlay of trauma, and I talk about that in the book, where people have already been conditioned to fawn, to flight, to flee, to freeze. It's like, okay, that's the right way to go. That's what I'm being taught is biblical. When in fact, Jesus, if we look at the Gospels again, he interacted with different kinds of people in
Mm,
different ways. Some people he
right.
called out, back off. Some people he called to heal and to give a role and to bring more into themselves.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, for sure. Well, so people don't just wake up one day being like, "Well, I want to be a little more selfish," or "I need, to sacrifice myself on the altar of selflessness." Uh, so how do people end up finding themselves kind of in these grooves of life, these kind of different patterns? You mentioned quite a few of them, but we don't have enough time to go into all of them. But you lose your sense of self a little bit through childhood wounds.
yeah.
And so could you kind of go through that? Like, what is that? What does that mean? How do we get to
Yeah.
where we are now?
Yeah, I talk about three factors I began to notice because I saw this over and over and over in my work with women, because I work primarily with women. This sort of, I love God, I'm empty. I feel empty on the inside, And again, I think it's true for men too. And so I started to notice three themes. One being childhood trauma, where you've been neglected, where you've been abused, where you haven't had that healthy, safe, secure attachment, where you've never felt the presence of someone. And if you think about a parent, your job is to teach a child that middle ground. You don't always get what you want, but it is important to know what you want.
Mm, mhm.
That's the parent's job, right? We're supposed to yeah, I know you want that candy bar. You can't have that candy bar. What is the real thing you want here? I mean, we that's the job of healthy attachment, healthy parenting. But in the absence of that, we default to the survival mode. We fight for what we want, which might show up more as selfishness, or we flee, or we
Mhm.
fawn, which means we work to just win everybody over around us because that's how we feel safe. And I feel connected when I get a hit of love from having pleased somebody else. That's what I saw the most with women, and it's a conditioned trauma response. You get something from that in your nervous system, even though you're never actually getting your own need met. And so I think this is where it's so nuanced. So again, and if you look at the message where Jesus says to deny yourself, if you look later, he says, when that seed that you bury in the ground dies and grows, you become your true self, your child of God self. There is also a sense of receiving. And so for folks who've dealt with some of these traumas, some of these childhood wounds, this process of healing is actually learning maybe to be a little more assertive, maybe learning to honor a need, a desire, a want, versus always setting those aside.
Yeah, and I think um, it's not culturally absolute, with women and men and things like that, right? But there is the personality styles where I had to learn in my own discipleship kind of life, to uh, offer my opinions much later in a conversation, to assert myself less often,
Mhm.
and to kind of tone down my involvement, like in group interactions. So as a pastor, um, brainstorming and all these types of things. But then when I started pastoring with my wife, who is a woman, right? And then a woman of color, like those things, our discipleship trajectories were actually going in totally different ways. Whereas the woman of color was like, I actually need to learn how to assert myself and stand my ground more often. And that for me, I'm learning the exact opposite, right? But we're both learning how to follow Jesus,
That's
depending
right.
on the kind of, you know, broken selves that we've kind of, acclimated to. And then following Jesus might look totally different. And so learning these types of things has been so helpful for me to remember, oh, yeah, the discipleship journey can be so different for people depending on where they are at, what they were given as a child, what kind of wounds and traumas that
Yeah.
they're recovering from, rather than
Yeah.
it's just one template, deny yourself, follow me, whatever.
I love the invitation to you, right? To your true self in that, to deny the parts of you that want to just go for it and be the leader and assert. And it's not just about, it's not that those are bad parts of you, but there is an invitation to you're going to become more of who God really wants you to become in that invitation. Just as the person who needs to learn to speak up more, who learns to be more assertive, is going to become more of who we really are in
Right.
that. There's an invitation to all of us to become more of this beautiful soul that God made us to become.
So then let's see. I got lots of questions still. So okay. So we'll just kind of, many of us can do the work of trying to find out those childhood patterns, or we
Yeah.
already know, or things like that. So, or at least you have the idea of that. But how do you, um, when you have the sense like, oh, I need to grow my selfhood in Christ a little bit, how do you start doing that work? Like what you mentioned, looking at painful patterns.
Mhm.
What does that mean, and what does that look like for people practically?
I think we become students, sort of observers of our own behaviors, our own habits. And oftentimes use this word, we need to get curious
Mhm.
about, so why am I showing up in this way? So in your case, why do I want to be the first person to get that idea out there? What's going on there? Is it just the way I learned and it's just a habit, or is there something behind there that if I don't, for me, you know, why am I so quick to just turn that conversation to you versus if someone says, "How you doing?" to kind of think about it for a minute and say, "I had a rough day today." What is, so you begin to observe what's going on, because that's a conditioned response that I learned. And it's just, I think of it as, but all of a sudden, and I think what happens is when we start, either someone else calls us out, or we start to realize, man, I don't feel seen in any of my friendships. I feel lonely. I feel angry. I feel all these negative, quote unquote, emotions become what I call a trailhead, which is an invitation to go down a path and go, that isn't that interesting. Why do I do that? That's so interesting. What does that mean to me? Where did I learn that? What's an early memory of, learning in my case to just kind of not really show up authentically how I'm really feeling, just always keep the focus on other people. Where did I learn that? Why did I learn that? And
Yeah.
then taking a couple of brave steps. But again, what I go into is when we do that, we tend to run into shame. Most of us do, because there is
Right.
a wound most of the time. Sometimes these are just habits, but a lot of the times there's a wound, no matter how big or small. And that's how we get to that. We start to notice shame. We're like, what's wrong with me? I'm such a jerk. I'm such a loser. I'm such a this. I'm such a, all the things we do to beat ourselves up. That's shame. And so when we hit shame, there's a good chance we are actually bumping up into a wound, right? That we learned this thing a long time ago. And we have to be willing to face that wound, because that how we set ourselves free and go, no, 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 it's not that I'm, a moron, that at the age of 32 I don't know how to, state a preference. It's because I learned this. I learned this habit, I learned this way of being. It's rooted in a wound. And then I can begin to observe it, and just slowly in those moments, there's that conscious awareness, right? That conscious awareness of, I do have a split second choice in this moment. I can change, but we have to work through the shame of that typically before we get to just that objective, that curiosity of what would it look like if I were to do this a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Well, so observing your patterns, like having those reflective moments, trying to not get always caught up in like every little thing that's happening. So shame is obviously shame is super important, but usually we're like avoiding shame, right? So that's not the first like thing we think about. Like, oh, like I am downstairs watching my favorite show because I'm avoiding shame, right? So what are uh, probably maybe but what are some of the more like clear trailheads, right? And maybe they're probably emotional, like fear or anger, or maybe like two, like, oh, I just got really worked up in a situation that's maybe disproportionate to what was happening. So like that would be a
Exactly.
type of trailhead, right?
Totally. Guilt, chronic
But
guilt, like
what
I
if
can't.
your spouse
Mhm.
says, "Hey, you're overreacting?" Because that never helps, right? When your spouse is the one pointing out that, your reaction is disproportionate to the situation.
Well,
I've tried it. It does not help my marital conversations.
you mean you telling your spouse that, or your spouse telling you that? It doesn't.
Both. It doesn't work either
Yeah,
way, not in the moment.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that's where humility comes in,
Yeah,
right? We
right.
have to go, okay, who's this person? Is this person someone I trust? Ouch, I don't like
Sure.
that. And also, is this an invitation to get curious because I've actually put this person in my life for a reason, or is this a stranger on the internet that I'm not going to
Right.
listen to? But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Those sometimes the people who are that was my story actually. It was the guy I was dating who was like, I can't, like could I talk about this in chapter 3. He did kind of call me out. He was like, I don't really want someone who just wants to please me all the time. I
Mm,
would actually like to know what you actually think about things, And ouch, I didn't like hearing that. But it did kind of make me go, isn't that interesting? Why do I do that? And is
mm,
it possible that isn't healthy for my relationships?
yeah.
So, it we have to be careful with each other. But also those can be some mirrors for sometimes those people in our lives can be mirrors that sometimes show us what we need to see.
Yeah, so trusted friends, trusted mentors,
Yeah.
people who know us that aren't just out to zing us or
Yeah.
something like that. So,
No, but kind of pointing out gently without shame, hopefully, hey, I noticed this. I noticed you get worked up. And again, with curiosity. I'm
right.
curious. Curiosity is I'm curious. You got so upset about that, and I get it. I, I'm just curious about it because I didn't see it quite that way. So help me understand what made you so upset.
Mm. So to go back to the other cultural cliff, like I'm a, pastor, theologian. So in the water
Mhm.
is phrases like, you need to speak your truth, just do you, the world be damned. And so in this process of finding your kind of or bolstering your kind of selfhood,
Yeah.
are you just saying like every desire that you have, you need to follow? And, every perspective that you have, and if people don't agree with you, then you just need to cut them out of your life. Like, because this is somewhat is in the cultural streams, right? So I know you're saying something different than that, but how is it like, what
Yeah.
is the difference?
That was the needle I really was trying to thread, which is why we put in the subtitle True Self in God, because there is exactly what you just said. There is this over extreme, which is just like whatever my truth is, that's what I'm going to follow. And it
Mhm.
doesn't really matter, you know, and that's not at all what I think this is about. But again, like I said, the other extreme, which is I should never consider those desires that tug at my heart, isn't healthy either. We're after emotional maturity, emotional and spiritual maturity. And so, if we think about it, in my first book, we talk a lot about this idea of the wise inner parent. Henry Nouwen talks about that inner place of love where the Holy Spirit lives, where we can bring all of those conflicting desires into relationship with, you know, inside of us, but with the power of the Holy Spirit and become discerning. And again, it may be like, here's the thing. I may realize I really want, let's say I keep using this example and I've just made it up, but let's say because it has nothing to do with my own life, but let's say your spouse wants to move to Chicago or has to move to Chicago, and you're like, I don't want that. That is not something I deeply desire. However, I am committed to this marriage. So selfhood honors the fact that there might be a sacrifice there, right? But if we just pretend, that's not honest either. If it's just like, it's fine, I do whatever you want me to do, I guarantee you there's going to be resentment, there's going to be depression, or there's going to be anxiety. But if we at least honor that desire and we say, man, this is not what I want. What I actually want is this. and two people begin to negotiate a way forward where it's like, okay, we've got to make a decision. We use this word compromise, and I sometimes use this word negotiate because
Mhm.
it's not just, it's for two whole people to come together and forge a life. And right now I'm kind of talking about marriage, but even in a friendship and honor both, there's a
Right.
lot of sacrifice. Of course, there's a lot of sacrifice, but it's not one person. This is where we get into codependency. One person just saying, I'll just be a doormat and you go.
Right.
That's not healthy. It's also not healthy, for two people to just kind of live in their little autonomous silos. Negotiation is, man, we're going to have to, during this juncture of our relationship, I'm going to maybe put my needs aside, but they are needs.
Mhm.
And at some point, we're going to need to honor those needs in some way, not in a way of holding. And maybe I've got to get those needs met apart from this relationship in a healthy way. Right. So it's honoring the contents of our soul so that we can be more healthy in our relationships with other people, not so that we can just go off on our own way with, who cares, my way or the
Right.
highway.
Right.
It's challenging to live as whole people, as Jesus said, loving others as ourselves. It's challenging. There's those both and of that requires two whole people to really be doing their own work so that they can show up well for each other.
Yeah. Well, and you don't go into this in your book, but that's why I always tell people, like, following Jesus is a communal activity because you
Yeah.
can't really follow Jesus and become a whole person if you're just by yourself, and that's why
No.
early on the church said, "Hey, that life of being a hermit and a recluse, like, that's not really the thing." And you
Yeah.
mentioned this, that word discernment, and, I've used that in other books and places where we don't wanna just declare like the truth to the world, and sometimes this is like evangelism or whatever, right? You don't
Yeah.
just shout at people whatever you think the truth is about anything, right? You're discerning with
Yeah.
people and with God, and you're working it through. While you were talking, and I don't want to make this into a big Enneagram thing, but, I'm a 3 and my wife's an 8, which is a very
Oh,
combustible connection. Yeah, I see your face there, right? So we've spent a lot of time negotiating our needs, our desires, and, how we commit and talk about these things. So for sure. Well, so speaking just to bring it back to truth and to kinda reach an end almost here, is you talk about transformational truth being kind of this overlapping of 3 things, which is facts, feelings, and faith. You kinda have this diagram. I was wondering if you could kind of just fill that out a little bit because a lot of people probably, like we've been saying, it's a whole nother episode would be like spiritual bypassing, where you can just use faith based language to kind of
yeah.
not really
I
move forward at all. Right. And then some people are just, for good or ill, like they're just all focused on their feelings. And then you talk about facts. How do these things kind of fit together?
Again, what exactly where you see culturally. So I was taught, shove your feelings aside. That's not healthy.
Right.
As a fellow Enneagram 3 with a strong 2 wing, well, that just led me down the road of
Ah,
complete self disconnect, right?
oh,
No
wow.
disconnection. I'm achieving or I'm helping. I don't have feelings, right? That was
Yeah.
not a good recipe for me. I had to learn to honor some of those feelings that, would come to. On the other hand, you hear just validate all the feelings.
Right.
Some feelings are not based, and so that's why I bring it in with facts. And so I'm constantly with clients, just constantly like, listen, your feeling is valid. You're angry. It's real. You are angry. That is just valid. That's a fact. Let's not deny that. Let's not
Right.
bypass. Let's not spiritualize that. So let's honor the angry. And this is where we get in. It's parts work. This internal family. A part of you is really angry. Now, that part of you might be angry based on what this person did. That part of you might be angry based on the fact that something happened in your real life that wasn't actually wrong, but reminded you of a pain from long, long, long ago. So if you don't do that work of getting to know why you're angry and what's behind the anger, honoring it, right? On one hand, but then understanding it so that you can hold it in tension with what actually happened. And that gets to your thing of did this person actually hurt you? Do something wrong? Maybe they did. And if they did, we need to pay attention to that anger so that we can figure out how to advocate for ourselves in a healthy way because that was wrong. And I don't want to put myself in harm's way. And that's foolish to put myself in a harm's way, to use the Proverbs.
Right.
So anger is a good cue, but these emotions are cues. On the other hand, I've seen it time and again in my office where someone is just angry at whatever, angry at some person, angry. And over time, I'm like, I don't think this anger is about that. you know, I think this, we gotta look deeper. And there's
Yeah.
just this angry wound from long ago. Um, that's kind of, so we got to look at that and set a healthy boundary around it and honor the pain from the past, but also understand it no longer is related to the facts of the present. So that's so much of the work that I'm doing with people is like trying to parse out. I get the feelings. I want to honor the feelings. And you think about when you parent kids, this is what we do.
Mhm.
Okay, you come from, I see that you're angry, you're mad at your teacher. Okay, I get it. You're mad. You can be mad. What actually happened? Let's get to the root of it, and
Right.
kind of do this both and of honoring and boundaries. Honoring and boundaries, right? What actually happened? What's the boundary either I need to set to protect myself, or what if indeed, somebody did something wrong, what's the boundary I need to set to protect myself? Or if the anger is my own stuff, I just didn't get what I wanted and I don't like that, what is the healthy boundary I need to set with that part of me? So boundaries are complicated, and I do get into boundaries in the book, and they are, again, when I talk about this stuff, I'm like, I live in this world, and I recognize it takes some work to pay attention to yourself, to pay attention to these reactions and responses and emotions. But if we don't, we're gonna misread the situation in
Mhm.
front of us, or we're gonna let old wounds get the best of us, or we're gonna set a boundary in a place, we're gonna weaponize a boundary, or we're not gonna set a boundary where a boundary is needed. It does
Right.
require some internal dexterity to figure this out.
Yeah. Dexterity and discernment. You're just talking about discerning the lives of your clients. We help discern the lives of friends, of loved ones, parenting. We're discerning the life of the
All the time.
desires of our children. How are our children, wanting this and that and siblings and then all this stuff, right? And so it's a communal activity.
It is. And it requires attention to ourselves, attention to the people in front of us, and attention to God. These really
Right.
paying attention to these three relationships that are all really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This is, just for everyone listening and watching, like we've just kind of just dipped our toe into just the wonderful book that you put together called The Best of You, Break Free from Painful Patterns, Mend Your Past, Discover Your True Self in God, which is key, which is what you said, right? In God. Um, but yeah, so thank you so much for that, as well. Uh, and I forgot to mention this. So for anyone listening and watching, you do also have a podcast that you just started called The Best of You, which I'm sure you'll be covering all this stuff and more. So if you're really
Mhm.
interested in Dr. Cook's work, please check that out and check out her book. Where can people find you online in all these places?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and Facebook. It's drallisoncook.com, and then my website's drallisoncook.com. So
There we
that's
go.
kind
So
of
it's
the,
just the
yeah,
name. It's
yep,
perfect. Easy to
just my
remember.
name, easy to remember.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I was just for everybody listening, I'm trying to get her to do an attachment talk maybe sometime in several months. So I think she's tentatively agreed. I'll have to talk to her publicist.
You
So, but
bet.
thank you so much for being on and just God bless your work and everything you're doing these days.
You too. Thank you.
Well, for everyone watching and listening, you can like and subscribe on YouTube as well as any of your favorite podcast listeners. And as always, this is brought to you by Grassroots Christianity.